Oke, selamat tengah malam teman-teman yang ada di Indonesia. Tapi saya tidak akan bicara banyak dalam bahasa Indonesia. Sekarang saya akan berbicara dalam bahasa Inggris. So let me turn now into English. Good evening or good morning in Indonesia. This is very late night in Indonesia, but I heard that some friends are waiting for this session because we have such a special session with a special guest. And also, as you can see here, we also have 4 visiting moderators on Theology. So this is such an honor for our team. I am not alone. I am with Yosia, but he is hiding now. He is very shy. And we have 4 visiting moderators, Fang Fang, Timo, Cynthia, and Joe. And we also have a very distinguished guest here, Professor Cristobal Serran-Pagán y Fuentes. I will introduce him first before I turn this platform to him. So, Dr. Cristobal Serrán-Pagán is a native of Spain who now lives and teaches at Valdosta State University, a public university in the state of Georgia. He is a San Juanist, a Mertonian scholar, who also wrote on the Jesuit paleontologist and mystic Teilhard de Chardin of the Society of Jesus. Dr. Chris got his BA at St. Thomas University, Miami, Florida, as part of an exchange program with Real Colegio Universitario María Cristina el Escorial, Madrid, Spain. Did I pronounce correctly, Chris?
Yes, you got it.
Thank you. An MA in History of Philosophy from Boston College, Massachusetts, and also a Master of Sacred Theology in Philosophy, Theology, and Ethics from Boston University. And he received his Ph.D. in 2003 in Religious Studies from Boston University. Dr. Cristobal Serran-Pagan, now at Valdosta State since 2007, I think. He received his tenure in 2014 and was promoted to full professorship in August 2019.
Amen.
His research interests include world religions, philosophy of religion, comparative ethics and mysticism, history of philosophy, ecology and world religions, philosophy, religion and films, systematic theology, and also business ethics. He has written a book on Thomas Merton and Tao, and on the prophetic mysticism of St. John of the Cross. Dr. Chris is editing a special volume on Spanish mysticism for the Religions Journal in Europe. So this evening, Indonesian time, we will discuss the prophetic mysticism of the 16th-century Spanish mystic St. John of the Cross, known as Doctor of the La Nada, the Nothingness, also known as the Doctor of the El Todo, the All, a very known Carmelite saint, and he has become an icon for the Catholic Church. So, Dr. Cristobal Serran-Pagan, thank you very much for joining us on this platform. It is such an honor for us. And
Thank you.
how's Georgia right now? How's Valdosta right now during the pandemic?
Always, hot and humid.
All right. So without further ado, Dr. Chris, let me turn now the time and the platform to you, and please guide us to know better who is St. John of the Cross and why did you say that he is a prophetic mystic? The time is yours, Dr. Chris.
Yeah, thank you, Nindio, and all of you for inviting me to this wonderful platform, and especially for keeping up on a beautiful day at night in Indonesia. But yeah, this book was a labor of love for me. Um, it took more than 2 decades to see the light because I wrote my my doctoral dissertation at Boston University on mystical vision and prophetic voice in St. John of the Cross, and my thesis director was Dr. Herbert Mason. So he was actually um, a correspondent with Thomas Merton, and he translated works of St. John of the Cross into French and into English, and so we share some common interests. And initially, I wanted to do a comparative study between St. John of the Cross and Thomas Merton, but unfortunately, I was not able to do so, and they allow me to use Thomas Merton as a major commentator of the of the Spanish mystic, but uh, at the end, that's what I did. And then over the years, I continue my research. Every time that I go back to visit my family in Spain, I visit places that have a history with San John of the Cross or Santa Teresa of Avila. So I often go, of course, to Avila, to Segovia, to Granada. All these places are full of history with the Carmelites. I was teaching actually, thanks to a study abroad program in the summer. We took students from all over Georgia to Madrid, and from there we had field trips, and we met with Carmelites both in Avila, where they have a university actually of mysticism run by Carmelites themselves. So they're good friends of mine, and I took them to visit this beautiful site, which is actually mm, just a few minutes walk from the the convent of the Incarnation, where Santa Teresa lived, and San John of the Cross met her and lived there for a while. So my interests in San John of the Cross go back, of course, in time when I was living in Spain, and then I came to the U.S. to study, to do my undergraduate programs and also graduate studies, and my interest in him continue to develop over the years until now. So I have been doing research on him for now probably more than 3 decades, and this book was an attempt to bring all that I have collected over the years. And the reason why I chose this title of prophetic mysticism in the context, in the historical context of 16th century Spain, is precisely because, as you know, San John of the Cross has often been portrayed only as a great contemplative and poet, as a monk, right, as the friar of the the discalced Carmelite tradition, often praying in his monastic cell. But the truth is that he was more than that. Yes, he was a Carmelite friar, and yes, he was a good Catholic, but he was also many other things, including a great poet. He also had, he walked throughout the Iberian Peninsula in those days, um, creating more establishments for the Discalced Carmelite, for the Teresian reform. So he was a confessor, a spiritual director. He was also rector. He was in different universities, playing different roles as administrator and as a faculty member. And he went actually as a student. He went to in a school. He went to a Jesuit institution, and then he manifested this desire to become um, a Carmelite, and he went to study at the University of Salamanca in Spain. And after that is when Teresa of Avila contacted him, and he said, "We need you. We need a good theologian and a good confessor and a good man of letters." and we want our nuns to be well educated, right? To have the best, theologians around, and get a great education, and then have a great confessor and a spiritual director and a good companion, a good friend among them. And of course, he became, as we know, the co-creator, the coadjutor of the Discalced Carmelite order. So Teresa and John are giving that acknowledgement of being the founders, the co-founders of the Discalced Carmelite tradition. So this was almost like a great match between two beautiful souls, and this idea of the prophetic mysticism came about um, as a result of all these studies that have been done until recently, where he was portrayed more as a person who withdrew from society in order to become a monk, a friar, and then they forgot his prophetic standing and his social religious involvement in Spain in those days, in 16th century Spain. So I was able to gather quite uh, uh, large data from many different books and articles that have been written until now. And after doing many trips myself, going back to Spain and to visit my family, I got a chance of meeting scholars and reading new material on it. And then clearly I knew that there was something more profound and more, deeper than just a simple monk. So I follow his footsteps for decades, and that's why I chose this picture. The picture that I chose is, in Spanish, we call it San Juan de la Cruz el Andariego, because like Teresa, they both were in the making, right? They are walking, they are establishing new communities for Carmelite brothers and sisters. And this picture actually came from a website. We asked permission to the Office of Tourism in Caravaca de la Cruz, which is located in the province of Murcia. And they allow me to use this picture of the monument that I saw many years ago when I visited this beautiful town with a lot of history. And the Carmelites funded communities there, and St. John of the Cross spent time living in Caravaca, just helping the nuns establishing themselves. So that picture, I think, was, perfect for this book, because it shows the more dynamic, the more down to earth person behind the mask, right? Behind all these different roles that he played as administrator of the Carmelite tradition, of the Discalced Carmelite order, as a rector of Alcalá, and in Baeza. He also was playing many different roles, and he, of course, became one of the greatest poets in Spanish literature. So he's greatly admired by people like Antonio Machado in the past, and all the great poets in Spain have given, their tribute. They have paid homage to these great intellectual and Christian humanists. So in that context of the 16th century Spain, San John of the Cross, of course, was born in what Teresa of Avila called tiempos recios, which means harsh times. It was a very harsh time because, as you remember from 16th century Spain, um, the Inquisition, of course, was in place. There were problems with heretical movements. The Catholic Church is fighting, heresies around Europe with Lutherans and others, and John and Teresa come from that background, from that historical background of harsh times, of tiempos recios, where the Kingdom of Castile promulgated laws based on purity of blood, where if you want to be in Spain in those days, in the Kingdom of Castile, And if you have to be Christian, you have to be a member of the only, Roman Catholic Church, the only true universal church. And of course, if you had Jewish or Muslim blood or ancestors, you were always suspicious, under suspicion in your own communities. And that's the thing that I found fascinating in my years of research about John of the Cross and Santa Teresa, because we know that Teresa came from Jewish backgrounds. We found documents that prove um, that they were found in the archives of Valladolid in the 19, I believe, 50s. They found that there was a legal procedure where Teresa's family was called um, uh, to the court because they were actually called Juda. They were practicing Judaism in secret. So when they came out, Teresa's grandfather and his father were, um, uh, I mean, it was mandatory that they have to wear the San Benitos, which was like a sort of penitence, and they have to walk through the streets of Toledo, and people will spit on them and mock them just because they were Jewish in those days. And now Spain has kicked out the Jewish from the Iberian Peninsula in 1492. So we're talking here about a century and a half later, right? And what happened to all those Jewish and Moorish people who were still living in the Iberian Peninsula, but now they have to convert to the Catholic Church in order to remain in the Iberian soil, right? So now we know more. We have found that not only Teresa of Avila came from Jewish background, but also um, there is great reason to believe that uh, John of the Cross father also came from Jewish background, and his mother probably was from Moorish ancestors. And we don't have yet any documentation to prove either case, because most of the documentation was lost. Uh, in the old days, they kept, the documents in churches and in other places, and when they were under the fires, they lost all the documentation. But if you follow their footsteps, in this case of San John of the Cross, San Juan de la Cruz, there are so many little things that point to the fact that probably, yeah, the by profession, John's father was a merchant of silk, and that was the profession that was held by the Jewish people in those days in the Iberian Peninsula. And then the mother was a weaver of silk. So that's why the two met. The father and the mother met because of that business, and they married. And the story goes that they were really in love. It was not a marriage of convenience, but a marriage based on real love. And that's the beautiful story of Saint John of the Cross, that he came out of a story of love, of two parents that love each other very much in those days, which was weird because in those days people don't talk about love, right? Romantic love. That's a modern conception, a modern concept. But of course, from the very beginning, they have to wrestle with this problem, with this social problem, because of course, if you came from a Jewish background and maybe a Moorish background, and in this case, probably John's father was um, more or less like middle class family, probably upper level class, coming from a wealthier family than than John's mother, who came from a more humble beginnings and origins. That created a dispute. It seems that it created a dispute between two different families. And especially if you were, again, coming from a minority group, in this case from a Jewish or a Moorish background, that was almost an stigma on you, and you have to hide it, because the purity of bloods in those days, the pureza de sangre, didn't want people to mix, and they didn't want people, to practice Islam or practice Judaism in secret. That will be good reason to arrest you, to torture you, and even to kill you in those days. So they have to be very, very careful about what they say, how they say it, and with whom they were relating to. So that's the story of the Discalced Carmelite tradition. It comes from the 16th century, even though the Calced Carmelite, of course, have earlier origins in the Middle Ages, in the 13th century, and it developed over time. The beautiful thing about the Carmelite tradition, the word in Hebrew, the word Carmel means garden, paradise. That's what it means. And what I found in my trips, following the footsteps of John and Teresa, is that everywhere they went, they created a beautiful garden, a beautiful paradise on earth. So the ideal of being a Carmelite, which trace back their origins to the Middle Ages, and its founder is the prophet Elijah, the Hebrew prophet, shows a clear lineage, a clear direct connection to also probably not only Teresa's Jewish background, but also John of the Cross. So they felt at home, of course, with being Christians and being in the Judeo-Christian tradition. They felt connected to the Old Testament and to the story of these great prophets. And the Discalced Carmelite tradition, of course, and the Teresian reform wanted to keep with what they call the mixed life, which is a theological term that comes from the scholastic tradition of Thomists, of St. Thomas Aquinas and others. The mixed life is an attempt to bring the contemplative life and the active life together. So neither one has superiority or priority. It's a balance between the two. And Teresa, in my opinion, in my humble opinion, and after years of research, I can say with 100% certainty that that's what she wanted for the Carmelites. Sometimes people portray them as if they want to return to the origins and only live in solitude and in isolation from other communities and isolation from, the social and religious and economic situation of where they are. But that's not true. The fact is, she built places in the middle of the cities in Avila. Teresa's first foundation is not outside the walls of Avila, but inside the wall. That's where San Jose, the San Joseph, first Discalced Carmelite community is founded. And I guarantee that if I will love to have a tape recorded when Teresa and John met for the first time, I will have loved to hear that kind of conversation. But I can guarantee that one of the things that Teresa wanted in St. John of the Cross is to bring him so that they can incorporate all this great knowledge and wisdom and love and compassion and bring this ideal of contemplation in action, to bring the mixed life to the Discalced Carmelite tradition and to train their brothers and sisters and their friars and nuns into this ideal of the Teresian reform, which is an attempt to not only pray, but also work, right? Teresa was famous for saying, what is prayer but not hard work, and more hard work? So the determining factor in the prophetic standing of St. John of the Cross goes back, to the history of Christianity from its very beginnings. And as you know, the word in the Judeo-Christian tradition, the word prophet is not only a person who foresees the future, but also a person who announces the good news and denounces the bad news, meaning the corruption, the social injustices of our times. And a good preacher, a good priest, a good Carmelite should bear witness to truth, to justice, and to love. Not only in a silent way, but in a very, a prophetic way. And that's what we mean by prophetic, right? By prophetic mysticism is an attempt to bring the two together. The prophet oftentimes is a mystic. You cannot be a good prophet if you have not been called by God as a messenger, right? So the word prophet is a messenger. It's a messenger, a friend of God, who serves as an instrument of God's love here on earth. And that's the beautiful thing of John and so many other great Christians in the 16th century Spain, like Ignatius of Loyola and many other great founders, right, of many different traditions who took these ideas of contemplatives in action, right? It was not just being contemplative nor to be active, but to bring the two together, to find the right balance between solitude and solidarity, right? Between um, between not only the supernatural but the natural, between um love for God but love for thy neighbor and love for thy enemy, and that requires a certain theology of love in action. So the ideal of a prophet is not only to predict the future, but in this case is even more than that, is to stand as a witness for justice, for peace, for love, for compassion, for solidarity, for God's will on earth, right? To see the kingdom of God here on earth, and to see the beloved community, as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. will call it, right? To see the full implementation of the ideal of a community based on love and based on respect and based on human dignity. And that's what John of the Cross brought to the Discalced Carmelite tradition. He was really trained as a theologian and as a philosopher in one of the greatest universities in Europe in those days, right? He went to Salamanca, where some of the best theologians were, exchanging ideas, and they were very, I mean, for that time, it was even progressive. I mean, they were even exploring things about Copernican revolution, which was condemned by the church in those days, and have troubles dealing with ideas of integration of science and theology and religion. So guess what? John of the Cross, in his poems and his commentaries, you can find even language that originated in these discussions in Salamanca with Copernican revolution and the ideas of how the galaxies and the stars move, and he made connections as a good Christian humanist. So he was a well-rounded person. He brought all these elements together, and Teresa knew it. Teresa wanted him with them. Teresa wanted the Discalced Carmelite tradition that was well rooted in the best, Christian values and Christian tradition, but also she wanted to open up the Carmelites to a new way of understanding themselves in relationship to God and the world. And they did. They were in contact with the best minds. They were surrounded by the best Jesuits in those days. Most of them were actually confessors and spiritual directors and theologians that Teresa brought to their order. And I guarantee they have a lot of spiritual conversations among themselves, especially if you look at paintings of Teresa and John. They are always portrayed as if they are flying, right? They are in ecstasy, right? The word ecstasy in Greek means standing, right, above yourself. And they seem to be flying because, of course, there are a lot of spiritual and mystical conversations among themselves. So the mystic is he or she who has a direct experience of the divine, while the prophet is one who bears witness, right, to truth, justice, and love. So the prophetic mystic in St. John of the Cross is one who, in this case, bring the two elements together, the contemplative life and the active life. And he did it in many different ways, by preaching, by teaching, by serving the communities that he was involved with not only the Discalced Carmelite friars and nuns, but also outside of them. He went to talk with people in the universities. He was in contact, with the lay communities. He was even in contact probably with people outside the Catholic Church. He lived in places where large population of Muslims and Jewish were still living as conversos. Avila had 20% conversos living when Teresa and John of the Cross met. That's a large population. When he went to Granada was the last bastion of the Muslims in Spain, and he lived across the Alhambra. He built actually a beautiful Carmelite monastery in a desert, in a true desert, where Muslims have buried in the past Christian prisoners. It was called El Desierto de los Mártires, El Campo de los Mártires, and then, which means the field of the martyrs, right? And what John of the Cross did was to ask permission to bring water from the Alhambra, and in those days, of course, it was in the hands already of Christian authorities. So he got the permission, and with his brothers, his Carmelite brothers, and his brother, literally, one of his brothers came to help because he was a handyman, and they built the aqueducts, and they built many things, gardens, and they created really, literally, a garden and a paradise on a desert. And if you ever had the chance to visit Granada in Spain, just visit this wonderful location, which today is called El Carmen de los Mártires, and it's open to the public. You can walk around, and it's beautiful. It's just next to the Alhambra. It's a wonderful place. I have pictures in my, this is one picture that I took in my trip. Let's see if I can show it to you. Let's see, yeah, here. This is the aqueduct that he built with his own hand.
Yeah, we can see that. Cool.
Yep, and yeah, it keeps actually the Moorish. We call it mudéjar. In art, mudéjar is the combination of Muslim and Christian art. And if you pay attention to those decorations, it keeps in touch with the Christian and Moorish tradition of Andalusian, right, and Al-Andalus architecture, which tells you again that in the mix of cultures, in the mix of traditions, you can also find beauty and strength and diversity in unity. And of course, Spain became a model for many people of faith around the globe, because we call it the period of convivencia, right? The period of coexistence. It was never perfect. It was never peaceful. But yes, Jewish, Christian, and Muslims lived together for centuries. And John of the Cross is a byproduct, like Santa Teresa, of this mix of cultures and religious traditions. Of course, they didn't mix in the sense of simply just, making a melting pot. It was more complex than that. It's simply they tolerated, they lived together. Each tradition kept their own people in their own communities. But we have a lot of stories of, for example, in the Mosque of Cordoba, they allow Christians to pray and worship when Christians lost their churches, or Jewish lost their temples or synagogues in those days, and they were allowed to pray in their own tradition in an Islamic mosque, inside the Islamic mosque. So that's what we call by the period of convivencia, that there was a mutual respect. And we know that they cooperated, they worked together. Even the administrators in the Spanish Empire hired Jewish conversos and Moorish, and they were part of the court, and they were translators, and they were administrators and tax collectors, and many of them share Jewish blood and Moorish blood. So that is a reality. We cannot hide it anymore. In the past, some Catholics and some Carmelites didn't want to tell this story because they were afraid that people will be kind of inclined to see John of the Cross and Santa Teresa less than Christian, because they were not pure Christian. They were not all Christians. They were what we call new Christians, right? New conversos, people who have to convert for different reasons. But that's why I was attracted to this project for decades. There are so many things. I learned about history, I learned about philosophy, I learned about theology, I learned about socioeconomics, I learned about the history of sociology in terms of different minority groups and what they have to struggle with just because they were Jewish or Moorish or Christians in my own homeland where I was brought up. And that's why I was fascinated with this study. And I call it in my title, I call it the Prophetic Mysticism in the historical context of 16th century Spain, because everything is contextualized. Once you get rid of the context, what is left, right? If there is no historical context. So teachings don't come from a vacuum. They come from history, from tradition, from a long legacy of many different cultures that actually live in the Iberian Peninsula. We have Jewish, we have Romans, Visigoths, Muslims, and many others who traveled through and left their legacy in Iberian soil. And that's what made who we are in Spain. Spaniards are a mix of many different, cultures. And when you walk through the street, you see it on your own. You can feel it, you can smell it. It's right there. And that's what I find fascinating about the Carmelites, that in a way, one of the things that I learned, and Francisco Márquez Villanueva, a famous historian who taught at Harvard for many, many years. He died some years ago, but he was actually the one who documented the many names with names and last names of people who entered the discarded Carmelite, and many of them, a large percentage of them, came from Jewish and Moorish converso families. So that tells you that Teresa and John of the Cross wanted to provide a safety place also for them. So if you wanted to become a Christian, actually, you didn't have a choice. You have to be a Christian in those days. You will have a shelter. You will have a place of security, a place to learn, a place to love, a place to learn about community, right? About the Christian values. And that's what they did. They opened more than 19 houses in the Discalced Carmelites tradition during the time of Teresa's life, which is astonishing. I mean, think about it. A woman in those days was not supposed to be part of an order. There were no women who were founders of Christian communities in those days. That was unheard in the 16th century. And here we have Teresa working with John and many others, trying to not only create a community for nuns, but a community for friars, for males, which is unheard. There were no women with the Cal's Carmelites. So Teresa opened the field for both men and women to work together, to exchange ideas together, like Jesus did, right? Jesus called women, be part of my ministry and of my movement, right? And he empowered women to be the best they can be as children of God, as messengers of God. And that's what Teresa and John of the Cross did, to empower people, to train them, to give them the tools to find who they are and to develop those skills so that they can also serve God and serve others in their love for humanity, in their love for their neighbors, and in their love for creation. And that's why the Carmelite tradition has so much also connections to nature, right? The poetry of St. John of the Cross is the first place that I will recommend anyone to go to, right? Just read their poems before you read their commentaries. And it's full of love. Love for humanity, right? Love for nature, love for animals. When you visit all these wonderful Carmelite sites, they're oftentimes located near to rivers, near to forests, near to trees, in wonderful, beautiful locations. And they wanted to inspire people, right? They wanted to green their theology, right? Green their theology in a very ecological way, in the sense that they wanted to live in harmony with nature and to preserve the kingdom of God here on earth, so that we can all be good stewards of the land. And that's where the prophetic side comes, along with John and Teresa working together and establishing many communities and walking the good walk and talking the good talk, and setting an example to others. And there are so many stories of how John showed his compassion towards people who were good friends, but also to the enemies. he, until the last day when he died, he showed his compassion even to the people who were mistreating and abusing him. I mean, remember, John of the Cross was kidnapped by his Carmelite brothers twice. He was put in a cell in Toledo for 9 months, and he has to escape. And there is a movie actually by Carlos Saura where it tells the story of John escaping from this monastic cell and going through the window and throwing himself in in Toledo, in the streets of Toledo, and escaping from that place because he was tortured, he was flagellated, and he suffered a great deal, and until the end of his life he suffered from persecutions with Doria, Nicolas Doria, and with other members of the church, and the prior of the Discalced Carmelite tradition actually was not very fond of John, and even John, until his last breath, forgave him, treated him with compassion. He didn't have any hostility or hatred toward the prior that mistreated him and didn't provide John with the right environment to heal himself from his illnesses. So it's a fascinating story. What I try to do in this book is to show once and for all that clearly St. John of the Cross meets the standards for being a great contemplative in action, like St. Ignatius of Loyola, San Juan de Avila, many other great preachers and teachers and theologians in 16th century Spain. And what he did was to actually offer a path in which we can all travel towards wholeness and towards holiness. So that Thomas Merton called it final integration, borrowing this phrase from a Sufi psychologist named Reza Araste. Reza Araste. Araste was a Persian psychologist, and Merton was studying the primitive Carmelite origins, and he fell in love with St. John of the Cross and Santa Teresa very early on. And he, of course, was attracted to John's poems because Merton himself was a poet. And he saw that the final integration in John of the Cross is a wonderful role model and a case study to follow in this as a good Christian, because you can see the development, right? You can see the maturity. You can see the late development of a very mature Christian who integrated the life of contemplation and the life of action through his life and through his writings and through his poems and through his witnesses as a human being on earth. And he will attend many lay community conversations, and also he will meet with authorities, with politicians and ecclesiastical authorities. So he was a man for all ages, and this image that we got of the dark night of the soul, right? The more kind of withdrawal person who embraced the suffering for its own sake is wrong. Is literally, in my opinion, is clearly wrong. It's not the image of the true John of the Cross that we know, and I have exposed him in my book through many stories and facts that I collected over the years. The good news is that in San Juanist studies, more and more scholars have been documenting now the new information that we are gathering. So we know more than ever before. So there are a lot of pieces of the puzzle that have been put together, and more people are interested in seeing the holistic picture of John and Teresa in regards to who these people were, and how polyphacetic, how multifacetic they were in regards to playing different roles as spiritual directors, co-founders of the Carmelite tradition, as poets, as hermits, as contemplatives in action, as people of letters, as humanities, as philosophers, as theologians, you name it. I mean, they covered a lot of ground, and they did it not only for their Carmelite friars and nuns, but they did it for everyone that needed help. They reached out to other communities with compassion and love in their heart and souls and minds. And that's the beautiful story of John, the Juan de la Cruz that I met in my book.
Wow, my God, it's very fascinating. It was very fascinating, sir. Professor Fuentes. I'm sure we were very blessed by your lecture. It's like for myself, it's like I learned a lot of things, you know, the history, social economic, and wow, it's very fascinating. So
Thank you.
I have one question. So from your lecture, you said that he was a converso, and also, yeah, so he was from the minority people group. That's what I thought, and he also have a threat of inquisition, and interestingly, although he was minority group, but he had a good social standing like that. So while I'm heard about that, I'm remember myself as a Chinese Indonesian, a minority group also in Indonesia. So one way for us to survive in Indonesia was to hide our identity as a Chinese and also work hard so we can have a good social standing. So my question is relating to this kind of issue. So I'm wondering, did John do like work hard, not only because his what I want to say, not only because of his theological insight, but also his identity. Like he want to prove, although he's from minority, but he can get a good social standing. That's what I've thought. I mean, how to relate that. So do you have a do you have a comment, something like that? I'm wondering about
Yeah,
that. Yeah.
that is excellent. That is a wonderful observation. Thank you for bringing this question, Adrianus. And first of all, I mean, there is, as I said during my brief talk at the beginning about the converso
Mhm.
history, there is no documentation. In the case of Teresa of Avila, we know for sure. That's 100% documented. In the case of St. John of the Cross, we don't have documentation that
Mhm.
prove that he came from a Jewish or Moorish converso background. But everything that I have studied and everything that I was able to get into my hands in archives and visiting their places and making connection to their professions and you name it. I mean, the high probability that
Mhm.
that John of the Cross came from a Jewish converso father's lineage is very high. I would say
Oh.
99.9%. In the case of being of his mom being Moorish, I will say there is also a very high probability because that was the typical profession of of a woman in those days dealing with silk. In regards to being a member of the minority group, clearly what you have said in the context of Indonesia applies to anywhere where you are a minority, right? No matter where
Yeah.
you are in Spain, Indonesia, or the United States, minorities are minorities, and sometimes they are assimilated, sometimes they are respected and tolerated, and sometimes they are persecuted.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
unfortunately, as I said during my talk, unfortunately, 16th century Spain was very tough. I mean, it was a century of persecution, of religious persecutions. There was also religious intolerance. It was what Teresa called tiempos recios, right? It was harsh times when people were under the suspicion, the
Uh-huh.
inquisitors.
Uh-huh.
The inquisitors, actually, Teresa's books were sent to the Inquisition. Also, John of the Cross was called by the Inquisition. Their writings were heavily censored by their people and by the
I see.
theologians and the ecclesiastical authorities. So they have to be very careful what they say, how they say it, right? And that's why, like you said, you have to hide your own identity. You cannot simply say, "Oh yeah, I come from a Jewish converso family," or "I'm, coming from a Jewish, a Moorish converso family." No, In those days, if you said that, you will be in trouble. I mean, you can be
Okay.
turned into the authorities simply because they will be vigilant.
Yeah.
They didn't want people who were converting to go back to their faith. They didn't want people who were coming from Jewish converso families to practice Judaism in secret, and they didn't want Moorish converso families to practice Islam in secret. So in that way, of course, it was very tough to live under such, atmosphere and environment. I mean, when I went to Indonesia, I remember I saw not only Hindus, I saw Buddhists, I saw Christians and Muslims and people like from many different ethnic groups, including Chinese. So it's a very diverse community. You have a great diversity in Indonesia, but as you mentioned, sometimes you have to hide your identities because society put so much pressure on you, and you have to make the best out of those limited conditions. And that's what John and Teresa have to do. Teresa said, my wish is to die as a good Christian, sister, and as a good child of God. And she, of course, have to hide her Jewish background and lineage because she knew that otherwise she would not have allowed to do what she did.
Yeah,
By the
that's
way,
why
we know
cool.
we have documentation that proves that the people who actually financed and gave money to the Carmelite tradition were Jewish converts, Jewish conversos.
Oh, I
So
see.
she was surrounded by many people who were Jewish converts and gave money to the Carmelites just to, find to create new communities, to found new communities. And her brothers also came to the Americas. They were in a way conquistadors, settlers, and they brought money, they brought gold with them, and they financed the Carmelite, the Discalced Carmelite Teresian reform. So they were always surrounded by Jewish converso communities, including in the University of Baeza, where John of the Cross went to and became a rector. There were many groups that were actually Jewish converts, and we know that. We know that many of their contacts and many of the people that they were having conversations with were minority groups.
Wow, that's fascinating. It's very interesting. It's like enlightening me. But well, guys, do you have question or you want to give a discussion for us? Maybe, please, Fang, Jonathan, Cynthia, or Timotheus. Yeah, Fang, please.
Thank you, Dr. Christ, for the lecture and a beautiful story that makes me want to go to Spain. Yeah, this is new for me, but I find it so so interesting with this. And based on what you mentioned before, I was wondering what makes San Juanist commentators think that Saint John separate his contemplative and social life, because I've only read his 7 spiritual poems briefly, so I couldn't find that idea. What makes the commentator thinks that Saint John separate his contemplative life and his social life? May you please explain that more? Thank you.
Thank you for your great question. And at some point, the signal was not very good. I couldn't hear the whole thing, but I think what your question is what made the commentators of Saint John of the Cross think that he was just a pure contemplative without any regard for social life, no, or economic or religious life outside the monastery. Is that your question about?
Yes, because I've read the poems that Saint John write, and I couldn't find what makes the commentator things like that. It's something like that.
Very good question. Very good question. I mean, there are many different reasons, but one of the most probably common sense reasons is that in the old days, there was not so much literature dealing with the historical context of St. John of the Cross. Most of the works that people used in the past were coming from hagiographers, right? The hagiographers are the people who tell the stories of saints, right? They built a story upon a story based on oral traditions and rumors and things, right? They want to make the person be more godly than God sometimes, right? That they are, perfect in some ways in their holiness, and I think that has caused many problems in the Catholic Church, because we know that all these great saints were great sinners, all of them. I mean, remember, St. Augustine fathered a child out of wedlock, and he became the bishop, right? And the famous one of the founding fathers of the Christian Church. And he never took care, of the son that he left, of the story behind, the fathering a child out of wedlock. Of course, he was not yet a Christian, but we know that this story has shaped Christianity in many ways in terms of original sin and sexuality and ethics, right? But in the case of John and many other Catholic saints, they were portrayed as if they were perfect, right? They were always saying the right thing. They were very careful of what they say to others. They were always respectful. They were always praying, and they were always kind of keeping that holiness within themselves. And that's true to a certain extent, but the side that most people ignore in the old days was that these people are human. They have human concerns, and they also care. They suffer when other people suffer, and they want to reach out to those who are in suffering, living in suffering. They want to alleviate the suffering for others, right? John, I mean, there are so many wonderful stories of John even buying even meat. I mean, buying or what the little things that they have in the monastery, giving to poor people, even to the friars when they were in bad health. He will take care of them. He will even sing. He will sing, and he will tell stories and jokes and poems. He will try to entertain them because he wanted to show his humanity, his full compassion to others. We know that before he became a Carmelite friar, he worked actually in Medina del Campo in a hospital which treated patients with syphilis. Syphilis patient, which is what we will call today, AIDS patients. He was working with people who were dying of this terrible sexual disease, right? Which was very common in the 16th century Spain in those days, and also around the world. This was one of the major reasons why many Native Americans died. When the Spanish came to the Americas, they brought syphilis and other diseases with them, and that exterminated many people around the globe. Many native people suffer from these encounters and meetings with Europeans. But can you imagine John of the Cross also was raising funds for the hospitals, doing charity work. He was singing, telling jokes to the end of his life, right? With his own brothers, living, with his own lay people, trying to reach out to these communities. And that's the story of love. That's the story of reaching out to others in the spirit of love and as a good messenger of God. So I cannot tell you, I mean, there are so many wonderful stories of how many he even stopped even thieves, and he will try to show compassion to them. And there are so many stories that are wonderful. Some of them probably were inflated because of the hagiographers, right? The historians who were not a historian, but the people who wanted to make him a saint and go through the whole process of beatification and canonization, probably sometimes exaggerated some of the stories that they heard about him. But the truth is that he was a great human being. He was a man of God, and he was truly holy. And many people knew that before he died. Many people look at him as a saint. like Thomas Merton. I mean, many of us look at him as a true saint, even though he was not beatified or canonized, but many people look at him as a great spiritual master and as a holy person. And that's true in the case of St. John of the Cross. Actually, it took longer than many other saints. It took almost 150 years to beatify and canonize him. And again, why? Because of course, some people have trouble with his theology. Some people have trouble with probably his own story. Some people thought that he was just simply a quietist, a heretical person, right? A rebel. They call him a rebel. The Cal's Carmelites, when they kidnap him, they call him rebelde, rebel. He was persecuted like many other good Christians in those days in the 16th century Spain. So I believe that also the dark night of the soul has been misinterpreted. It has been taken out of context. Many people have made the dark night to be almost a masochistic kind of theology where you have to suffer in order to encounter God. And that's not John of the Cross. By the way, John of the Cross defined the dark night as infused contemplation and mystical theology. That's what it is. Infused contemplation, which is encountering God, right? And in having a direct experience of the divine. And he never used, by the way, the phrase "dark night of the soul" is not from him. The book, the poem was "Noche Oscura," which means dark night. That's it. The dark night of the soul is a phrase that has been attached to his name for centuries. And many people have played even in psychology with this idea of suffering, which in my opinion has done more harm than good, because the dark night of John of the Cross is simply the mystical experience, which is joyful, is when you feel connected to the source of life, when you are connected to the infinite love of God. And that night is called night because it's dark. And why is dark at night? Because God is a mystery. Even the mystics encounter God in a mysterious way. And even though they have an experience, they cannot say 100% what God is, because God is beyond faces. God is beyond a human face. Actually, in the biblical tradition, Moses never saw the face. He have to play with the metaphor of seeing the back of God, never the face to face, because no one can see it. It's a mystery, right? And it's a mysterious being that is infinite and is permeating the whole universe. The Spirit of God is so vast, so majestic, that it transcends the mind. And that's why John of the Cross, in his poetry and in his commentaries, addressed this need to always expand our understanding of God and don't put God into a box, right? Don't put God into labels, because that can create, a problem for many other followers. And it's better to open the gate than to put God into a cage.
Yeah.
Dr. Case, I have a burning question. Fang Fang, sorry, you have a further question?
Oh no, just
Yeah. But to build on your question, Fang Fang, and what just said by Professor Chris, I was wondering, because the theme of mystery, great mystery, it sounds like John's mysticism is more apophatic. And I was wondering if he also read like Meister Eckhart or Pseudo Dionysius. What do you think, Chris? And I will let my friends add left this.
Yeah. There is documentation that we know for sure. He quoted from Pseudo Dionysius for sure, because Pseudo Dionysius is the first great Christian mystic who systematized not only the apophatic tradition, but also the cataphatic one. So John of the Cross, even though in some cases he put emphasis on the apophatic mystic, I will even dare to say that he will also be a cataphatic mystic in many ways. How so? Because of course he's a man of integration, right? He's a man looking for wholeness and holiness, and that means that the way of negation and the way of affirmation go hand in hand, like the yin and the yang. The complementary of opposites go together, and in this case, la nada y el todo, right? The nothing and the all goes together. The nothing is not nihilistic in the case of Saint John of the Cross. The nothing means it's a no thing, no dash thing. Why? Because God is not a thing, is not an object among objects. So that means that God is not an idol among other idols. Jewish, Christian, and Muslims have always passed this tradition of be aware, right? Be aware of idolatrous people. Be aware of idolatry. In the Islamic tradition, shirk, right? Be aware of shirk. In the Jewish tradition, of course, we have many stories of the golden calf, right? But unfortunately, of course, Christians sometimes have made idols out of Jesus and out of human beings, elevating them to the status of God as such. And the great mystics understand that even though you can be in the presence of God, and God is always within us. God is always within us. In the Hebrew tradition, Emmanuel is translated as God is in us, not only with us, but in us. It's in us. I mean, in the Islamic tradition, Allah is closer to your jugular vein than you to yourself, which sounds actually very familiar to Christian, because St. Augustine says something very similar, that God is closer to you than you to yourself. So in that case, God is always present in us. The problem is that we are the ones who are not present to God. We are disconnected from God sometimes. And what people of good faith and good heart and good soul needs to do is like to be good peacemakers, to build bridges rather than walls, right? To be reaching out to others who are who are suffering, to hear the suffering of the world, to listen to those who are in big pain and in big suffering, so that we can bring a sense of hope and a sense of humanity and a sense of compassion. And that's the beautiful story of John and Teresa, that they were able to, out of these mystical experiences, they understood that we're all connected. That's why they didn't have any issues meeting people of other faiths and other cultures, because they are also children of God, regardless whether they believe in the Catholic God or not. They are people of God. They are children of God, and they deserve to be treated with love, respect, and dignity. So when you have that deep understanding and appreciation, and you see God in everything, I mean, by the way, this is biblical, right? 1 Corinthians 15:28. God is, was, and will be all in all. I mean, it's very clear. It's very panentheistic. It's not pantheist. That, by the way, is my other major theological topic that I have addressed in my work on Teilhard de Chardin and Thomas Merton, where clearly all these great Christians were panentheistic, not pantheists. And they saw God presence in all things. By the way, this is the Jesuit motto of Ignatius of Loyola, right? That God is found, the greater glory of God is found in all things.
Amen. Well, thank you. Now, Timo, Cynthia, or Jonathan? Jonathan, I saw your hand.
I feel like I'm in love with Saint John's theological concept of mysticism. Wow, it's very mind blowing. I want to know more in add-on to the theological base of the Saint John. If Saint Teresa invited Saint John to be a theologian in Carmelite order, there's some valuable theological base of Saint John that Teresa is interested in. So, in the introduction of Ascent to Mount Carmel that Alison Pierce wrote that if Saint John of the Cross is able to climb the greatest heights of mysticism and remain upon them without stumbling and dizziness, it is because his feet are invariably well shod with the truths of dogmatic theology. I mean that Saint John has a very strong basis of theology. I'm very interested in what specific theological dogma that Saint John refers to in his mystic theology. In comparison, in my research I found that Teresa of Avila is building one of her foundation of mystic theology in reading from the confession that Saint Augustine wrote. How about Saint John? I'm very interested in his theological base.
Yeah, both of them, Teresa and John of the Cross, they drink from the fountain of not only the mystical tradition, the rich mystical tradition, not only with Pseudo Dionysius and the German mystics. By the way, Meister Eckhart, we don't have any clear evidence, but clearly there were some German mystics that they read and they were circulating around in Castile in those days. So they have access to many wonderful treatises written by Spanish mystics and German mystics and English and others. But in the case of dogmatic theologians, John of the Cross is more what we call a scholastic, right? Remember, he went to the University of Salamanca, and in those days, St. Thomas Aquinas was big. I mean, in the Catholic Church, Aquinas is the theologian per excellence, right? So that means he was trained as a good scholastic theologian, but because he had that mystical inclination, not an inclination, but he had mystical experiences himself, he's able to bring the two together. He's bringing this rational, scholastic kind of language, which sometimes is very dry, but then he's able to sweeten that scholastic dogmatic theology with the flavor of experiential faith, with infused contemplation, with mystical theology, which is a face-to-face encounter with the living source of life. So when you bring these two together, it's like a cocktail Molotov. It's perfect in terms of explosions of love in multiple directions. And that's where the poem Living Flame of Love comes from, right? I mean, the living flame of love is a good example of showing that the dark night is overflowing of love. It's not suffering, but the suffering, the goons, he used the language of the goons of love, is actually the markings of God. It's the stigmata, not in the sense of the bloody kind of masochistic way that we sometimes have portrayed St. Francis of Assisi and others with the marks of Christ. But the marks and the goons of Christ are the God is marking you by living an experience of tasting the Lord of the universe, the Pantocrator, right?
Okay.
And that flavor is mixed with theology. And that's why he got in trouble. Because, of course, when you say, I have a direct experience of the divine, and then some people in the institutional church are telling you, you have to follow what we are telling you, right? You have to follow what we say, regardless whether we have an experience of God or not. Then, of course, that is going to create a clash of values and a clash of ideas, because some authorities don't want to be challenged by those who have direct experiences of the divine. And that's why mystics in many different traditions have been persecuted, marginalized, tortured, killed, and they suffer from martyrdom.
Yeah. Wow, amazing. So there's synergy between the scholastic basis of Saint John and how he met with Saint Teresa, so that his love with God is becoming the energy for him to do everything in scholastic prophetic mission. Wow, amazing. Thank you for the explanation. Wow, amazing.
Exactly. Yeah, and of course, what he's doing is simply trying to make the scholastic theology more meaningful, so that it reaches out to others, and by embracing a larger kind of vision of life that incorporate mystical theology. I would say St. John of the Cross is more a mystical theologian than a scholastic one.
Timo or Cynthia? Okay, Timo. You have to unmute yourself first. There you go.
Yes, you can hear me? Yeah. Professor Chris, thank you for your insightful presentation. since you since you mentioned about love before, and also about, you said that God is everything, God is in everything, the Spirit of God permeates in everything. So when I think about this, what comes up in my mind is the Spirit is the one who animates us, who moves us. So it must be something that is related to desire, not only desire, but very very strong desire. Then it should be about love. In this connection, what actually Saint John teaching, or Saint John thought about love, what love means for him, and how it is related to prophetic mysticism, and the and uh, and in the balance of contemplative and action, like you said before. Is it?
Wow, this is a wonderful question that we could spend years and years talking about it. But in a short, let me put it in a short synopsis, I'm trying to answer as best as I can your question because it's wonderful, very insightful one, Timo. Um, Basically, the theology of love in San John of the Cross, which, by the way, in my book I dedicated a whole chapter. It is the chapter, I believe, is chapter 4. I dedicate a whole, yeah, it's chapter 5 in the book. It's called The Mystical Path of Love, which, by the way, I use the Raimundo Paniker and the Hindu tradition to elaborate on the tripartite model of karma yoga, jnana yoga, and bhakti yoga. And I use that tripartite model because I was mm, I was looking for a holistic approach to St. John of the Cross by telling the story that John fits the model of a mystic of action, a mystic of wisdom, and a mystic of devotion and love. So the love that St. John of the Cross talks about and writes about and composes in his own music, even music and poetry, is is what he calls the universe is an ocean of love. El universo es un océano de amor. Why? Because God is present in the smallest particles from nature to the greater galaxies, so that the whole universe is already feeling and breathing the air and the spirit of God. And it's not pantheistic because God is not nature and nature is not God, but God is in nature and nature is in God. And that means that we can find God anywhere we go. Even if we take a rocket and go outside the planet Earth, God is still present no matter where we go. No wonder why the great Jewish nomads and the great shepherds took God with them to the mountains, right? To everywhere they went. They didn't need to have just simply a Jewish temple. God was present in their lives, inside and around them. So when you contemplate the beautiful part of nature, you bring to your attention the presence of God. And John of the Cross wrote about it, of being near a river, and he will say, "Soledad sonora." It's like, uh, it's like, uh, it's like a
Sound of
paradox, right?
solitude. Is it?
Yeah, exactly. It's like the sound, the silence speaks, right? The silence, the solitude and the silence brings a sound, a sound that is different from other sounds because it's a sound from God, directly from God. And that means if you have ears to hear and eyes to see, you will see God everywhere, present and dwelling in all things. So for him, trying to answer now your question of how love relates to prophetic mysticism, of course, if you love and you know that we are all connected and you have this deep experience of being grasped by something greater, not only than yourself, but is greater than even the whole universe, physical universe, right? And is encompassing everything that it is. Once you are in the presence of that, which is which is the source of infinite life, the only way out and only way to respond to that love is by being more compassionate, because we know that we are all connected, because we know that we are all interrelated, because we know that there is no way out but through love. Because you can work for peace and justice, but if you don't have love in your heart and soul, all our actions will be wasted if they are not rooted in a deep contemplative vision of reality. And by the way, those who are contemplatives also have responsibilities and obligations towards others. So John of the Cross understood very well his responsibilities, because as a contemplative, he knew that he cannot remain silent when people are struggling, when people are in suffering, right? He's trying to minimize that suffering, because some suffering is inevitable, but most of the suffering is avoidable, is unnecessary. And like in the Buddhist tradition, they say pain is inevitable, but suffering is unnecessary and unavoidable, because the mind of the person, right, is the one that dictates that kind of choice that we make in life, and can bring good or bad depending on where we are in our state of consciousness and stations of the mind. And that's why it's so important to meditate. That is why it's so important to look for inner tranquility. That is why it's so important to develop compassion, contemplative and compassionate um, lifestyles that bring a sense of the holy, the sacred, of that which you have experienced and you are trying to transmit, and serve as a vessel and as an instrument of that love of God to humanity and to creation, so that the love that St. John of the Cross experienced in his own life is leading him to become more compassionate and to become a good prophet and to become a good friend of God. And that's what a good prophet is a good friend of God, is a good companion of God, is a good instrument of God here on earth. So that's why the connection between love and faith and justice is so important. It's crucial. I just wrote actually a poem, and a few things a few days ago about this, which is contemplation without action is wasteland, is a wasteland. And an action without contemplation can lead us blindly and can do more harm than good. So the beauty of these Spanish mystics is that they were able to bring the mixed life of St. Thomas Aquinas into fruition by bringing the contemplative life and the active life together. Which, by the way, this is what in the Christian tradition we call by the theology of Mary and Martha, which Meister Eckhart and many other great mystics already elaborated and wrote about it. Mary is the symbol of contemplative life. Martha is the symbol of the active life. And that's why when you read Teresa and when you read John and you read Eckhart, pay attention to that language, because for Meister Eckhart, actually, Martha was more important than Mary as the sister of Bethany.
That's true.
Because Martha is already doing what a good contemplative will do, which is to take action. Because Martha has already listened to the teachings of Jesus as the Christ. And from that direct experience or revelation, she's able to respond with love and compassion in her heart, and is able to take care of the kitchen, and is able to take care of the guests who come to home out of love for God, out of love for humanity, out of love for thy neighbor. So Mary and Martha are sisters. Mary and Martha are one. Mary and Martha are in all of us. We all need to be Marthas and Marys and Marthas. We need to be all contemplatives in action. That is the great legacy of St. John of the Cross. And for John, faith is more than doctrinal faith. It's not blind faith in an institution. It's not blind faith to God. It's a deep experiential faith in God out of a living encounter with the ground of being. And that means you know. When you know, you know. When you taste, you taste. And when you know that you are in the presence of God, you can know that there is something greater than yourself, and you know that you are in good hands. And that means the question of whether God exists or not is no longer irrelevant to you, for you, because you know it. You have tasted it. You don't have to ask that question anymore. You know it from experience. So you are not blind by what people tell you. You know it from experience. You know that God is within you, working with you from day one to the last breath and beyond.
Well, this is very beautiful, Chris, because for some mystics, when they deal with Martha and Mary, some mystics say that Martha will be turned into Mary, will be changed into Mary, but mystics like Meister Eckhart and even I think St. John of the Cross did not say that, right?
No,
Martha is
no.
Martha and Mary is Mary. And
Yes.
these are...
Even Teresa clearly said, Teresa clearly said, what is prayer? What is the contemplative life about? More good work, more good work, more good work. Meaning more Martha, more Martha, more Martha.
Fascinating. Chris, there are still 3 questions. I don't know if you still have time to answer
Yes.
these questions. Fascinating. All right. So, first questions from Jin Hao Lim. What is the difference between mystical prophetic with the sixth sense that sees something in the future?
Can you explain more about the sixth sense of seeing in the future? Can you elaborate more on that one?
I think it is not the 5 senses that we have, but something, the sixth sense that we can see the future that still doesn't exist right now.
Okay. Yeah, that's why I try to be very careful when I define the word prophetic, right? Because many people understand a prophet or prophetic messages as predicting the future, right? Looking for certain things that may happen in the future. But in the case of St. John of the Cross, it's not so much predicting the future, but rather making room for the future. Meaning, out of this deep connection with the source of life, what are we going to do with this great gift of grace? It's like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a great mystic and prophet, will say, where do we go from here, right? If you know what you know, and you know that you are always in good company, and God is always with us, Emmanuel, right? Then where do we go from here? I mean, do we want to create the right conditions for justice and peace in the world or not? It's like Thich Nhat Hanh. It reminds me of the great Buddhist spiritual master who was also a good friend of Thomas Merton and Dr. King. And he said, we have a choice. We can plant the seeds of love and contemplation in our lives, or we can choose to plant the seeds of hatred and fear, which paralyze us. It's always a choice. So that means we don't know what the future will bring. But what we know with certainty is that if we don't do the right things now, what kind of future we will have later on. So you don't need to be a sort of prophet who will have visions of the future to know that planet Earth is warming, literally warming, is on fire. And if we don't take care of this beautiful planet Earth where humans, almost 8 billion people live, what do you expect in the next few days, years, and decades from now, if not more trouble, knowing what we know now? I mean, it's very simple. So we can
Thank you.
predict certain things.
Thank you. Cynthia. Yeah, you haven't asked anything. Yeah, please, the time is yours now.
I'm sorry because I'm so in love with Chris' explanation about Saint John of the Cross.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's
it's very enlightened me. And actually, I have 2 points of my curiosity. But first point, I think Chris have answered it. It's about I have read about a discussion and debate that John mystical imagery has influenced by Islamic source, and I think Chris has answered it. So it also answered my question why Chris used Raimondo Panikkar to see Saint John of the Cross. So I think it's a really good news for interregional search and studies because Saint John of the Cross never mentioned before in interregional studies. And my second curiosity is uh, Chris has mentioned about the most famous masterpiece of John, the Dark Night of the Soul. But I read there's another one about spiritual canticle. May you explain us about it more little if the time is so limited? I really,
Wonderful.
really love to hear about it from the expert. Okay, thank
So
you.
thank you, Cynthia. Those were also two great questions. To begin with, the first one, actually, I have some books here that, yeah, this one, this is one of the greatest authors in the San Juanese studies who have written about the connection between San John of the Cross and Islam. Is called Luce Lopez Baralt. She's from Puerto Rico. She retired, but she's an authority in the field. She followed Palacio, Asim Palacios, and others, and in regards to the Sufi Islamic kind of theology and spirituality that we can find in some commentaries of St. John of the Cross, but especially in the poems. The poems, I mean, the Sufis, when they read St. John of the Cross, they think that he's a Sufi, which tells you clearly there is a connection. If not direct, clearly they are drinking from similar sources, either from God directly, who is the same God, if you believe in that, or from sources that they knew in those days, because they were in contact with Muslims who were converts in Spain. So to answer your first question, yes, clearly John of the Cross actually served as a bridge between Christians and non-Christians. Especially, there are many comparative studies between John of the Cross and Buddhists. Many people have seen him also as a Buddhist, especially Zen Buddhism, in his apophatic kind of way, right? The way of negation and Zen get along very well, like Master Eckhart, right? I mean, la nada, the nothing in San John of the Cross resembles in many ways the concept of sunyata, right? And emptiness, and letting go in the Zen Buddhist tradition. And then in the Greek patristic way, of course, is the kenosis, right? The letting go of egotistical desires, which in the Sufi tradition is letting go of our egotistical desires, which they call nafs, right? The nafs. We have to overcome our egotistical desires in order to allow God, in this case Allah, to be present, more present in us, because God is already within us, but the problem is that we are not present to God. That's the problem. So how can we become more present? It's like in the Buddhist tradition, awake, right? Fully awake to reality, so that we can be in the presence of life, of that which is, which of course in the Zen Buddhist tradition is the concept of Satori, right? Satori is the concept of enlightenment. So in that way, there are a lot of connections with St. John of the Cross mystical theology and poetry, and Zen Buddhism and Sufis, and even I will dare to say there are even connections to the Hindu. There are many Hindu also studies, comparative studies between St. John of the Cross and some of the great spiritual masters in the Hindu tradition, as well as in the Jewish tradition with Kabbalah. I mean, I could go on and on, but now that I'm editing the Spanish volume for Religious Journal, and I have been inviting scholars from these three different continents, and they are talking about, in their research about Moses de Leon, the author of the Zohar, which is the most important study of Kabbalah, right, in the Jewish tradition. And guess what? Moses de Leon lived in Avila, and some people believe that he was actually buried in the cemetery, in the Jewish cemetery, which, by the way, the convent of the Incarnation, where Teresa lived for 27 years, is standing on top of the land
No
where the
way.
Jewish people were actually not only buried, but we have documents that prove that the Carmelites bought the property from a Jewish family.
Wow, this is interesting, Chris.
So there are a lot of connections. I mean, this is mind blowing because we
Yeah,
know that there were many bridges between Jewish, Christian, and Muslim, but now we also know that in terms of scholarship and practical theology, there are many people who are doing great job with interreligious, dialogue and interfaith dialogue and ecumenical dialogue. And I mean, I could give you many names, but as you know that this field is getting, it's expanding, and John of the Cross, it will become also a great, I think, example for this period of convivencia and coexistence, and the language is so relatable, and we can all connect to that kind of experience, which is universal and timeless.
thank you, Chris. There is
By
a
the way,
question. Yes.
yeah, and the
Yes,
second
please.
part of the question,
Oh, yes.
what was the? Can you please remind me of the second part of the question, because I forgot. I don't know if I answered it.
May you explain about the spiritual capital, the other one?
Yes. Sorry, I forgot. I knew that there was a
It's
second part of the
okay.
question, but I got too passionate with the first part. Yeah, the second part of the question, yeah, that's a wonderful. Also, remember, St. John of the Cross wrote, as we know. I mean, probably he wrote more things because we don't have everything that he wrote. I mean, some things were actually incomplete or lost. Until we find more manuscripts, we will never know. But the beautiful thing is that he left 4 major commentaries, right, and many beautiful poems, and also he left what he called advice, right, of wisdom, of spiritual wisdom, which are the counsels, right, the giving people with letters and advice, spiritual counseling. But in the case of the spiritual canticle is one of my favorites, because when you read that famous, not only poems, the poems are incredible, but when you read the commentaries, you can tell that it's very affirmative, right? It's very much in love with creation. It's very, in a way, it's following also the theology of the Old Testament of putting emphasis on creation and not so much on the afterlife. The Jewish tradition put more emphasis on this life rather than the next. And creation is very important in Genesis, right? So when you read John of the Cross, it's very interesting because he quotes more time from the Old Testament than the New Testament, which is again another sign that he was feeling at home with the Jewish tradition. It's very interesting. But yes, the spiritual canticle goes hand in hand with the living flame of love, with the dark night, right? And it complements each other. They are actually in Avila. They have, in a Carmelite church, they have the 4 classic uh, uh, titles next to each other in a painting. So they have the whole thing for you to see from the altar. It's a beautiful painting.
Wow. Awesome. Amadeo asked a question. I will summarize. The question is that prophecy in St. John, as we heard from you, was very active, contemplative, but also take part in actions. But why then it become privatized? What was the turning point, Chris, that the prophesy from the social action became very privatized? Do you have any comment on that?
You mean privatize in
Yes.
terms of making it more private and to
Yes.
the individual?
Indeed. Yes.
Very, yeah, that's a very interesting question. I mean, remember from the 16th century in Christianity, we have inherited a sort of individual salvation. Sorry, someone is calling my. I'm going to put the phone. So we have inherited this kind of individualistic path to salvation, which, by the way, the Catholic Church in a way was responsible because, of course, they were selling indulgences, right? Martin Luther responded with, the famous 95 Theses, and that created a war between Protestant Christianity and the Catholic Church. But in this case, in the case of Saint John of the Cross, why his prophetic side has not been affirmed more, and why it has been left out, and why we don't know much about his social standing, I think it's simply because people were also trying to protect him in the 16th century. They didn't want to make him an icon of activism in the sense that, or being a prophet, because in those days, of course, people will not be called prophets. That was a big word to handle. But they wanted to protect him in terms of leaving a legacy and beatifying and canonizing him. So the hagiographers, even though may have good intentions of telling, this story of a saint, at the same time, they did a lot of damage by hiding the identity, the true identity of this human being, who is more than just a saint. Is more complex and more nuanced and more beautiful than just simply a simple saint or monk. It's more than that, for sure. It's a child of God. It's full of secrets. It's full of mysteries. It's full of joy and sufferings that he has to endure. So my take on this is that the hagiographers and the people who wrote about John of the Cross after 16th century wanted to have this stamp of an angelic person, right? Putting more emphasis on the contemplative life of Mary, and they forgot about the Martha. They forgot about the active life that he was so much in love with, and he died for it. I mean, he died traveling. He died in Úbeda. That was not his place. He was traveling in Andalusia. He left Granada. He went even to Lisbon. I mean, he went walking. He walked. Some people have written that he walked more than 500,000 kilometers in his time, which is incredible.
Yeah.
I mean, sometimes he will go on a donkey because the Carmelites were not allowed to go on a horse.
Yeah.
Something. I mean, you have to be very sick to be on a carriage, but mostly he did it by walking. That's why I have this picture that I love so much, because he's in action, right? He's walking with his stick, right? And going through all the Iberian Peninsula, all the way to Portugal. He went to Lisbon and met there with other theologians when he became part of the administration of the Discalced Carmelites after Teresa died. So he became actually one of the greatest administrators of the order, but then he got in trouble with the general Nicolas Doria, who came from Italy, and he was a tough guy, that probably disliked John for many different reasons. Because of course he was the companion of Teresa, and he was actually very charismatic, and many nuns, actually the nuns loved him. The nuns were in love with John, and John was in love with nuns. I mean, every time that they met, they didn't want him to leave. They wanted him close to them, and he gave them many advices. He learned from the nuns as much as the nuns learned from him. So it was a beautiful community of people who love God and love humanity and love creation.
Thank you, Chris. There is a question or a couple from Vivi, but I'll summarize. Vivi Chandra asked whether you touched about panentheism. And do you think that panentheism is compatible with the Catholic faith? And do you think that all mystics subscribe to panentheism?
Very good question. Is of course to say that all mystics are panentheistic is of course very. I will not go in that direction. I will have to probably contextualize each one of them. But what I will dare to say is that all, especially Christian mystics and Sufi mystics and Jewish mystics, are panentheistic. All who are healthy, true mystics. Now, what is panentheism? Panentheism is simply the belief that God is present and dwelling in all things, and all things are present in God. So, I mean, this is, more biblical than this, impossible. St. Paul repeat this constantly, that God is all in all, right? God is, in Corinthians, is full of biblical passages where you always find the preposition in. That's the key word. The preposition in changes the whole thing, because it's not saying that God is everything. It's saying simply that God is in everything. God is present in all things. And in that sense, clearly, the panentheistic mystics and the Catholic faith are totally compatible, because in a way, even St. Thomas Aquinas and St. Augustine and many others leave room for divine transcendence and divine immanence. So all of them are not saying that God is everything. What they are saying is, yes, God is on one level, is transcendent, but on another level, is present everywhere in the universe. And that's why John of the Cross said the universe is a sea or an ocean of love, because God is love, and love is God. This is, of course, St. John in the Bible, right? But a different John. but in this case, John of the Cross also saw the interconnectedness between the biblical tradition that he's in love with his panentheistic prophetic mysticism that allows him, allows St. Ignatius of Loyola and Teresa of Avila to embrace everything that it is and to respond to life with faith, with love, and with justice in their hearts and souls and minds. And that means, of course, that Mary and Martha are one, and the idea that they are heretics is nonsense, because more orthodox way of thinking than this, you cannot find it anywhere else. And by the way, the inquisitors that were investigating Teresa and John of the Cross never found them to be guilty, never. And they got a lot of writings from them.
Fascinating. Chris, I have one burning question in me. St. John lived in an era of colonialization when Spain and also Portugal expanded their boundaries, right? So what did St. John say about colonialization, if any?
This is a very interesting question, because, of course, it's hard to know what he will have said, because he never left anything in writing. And of course, post-colonial thoughts today is very trendy, and we have a lot of information. But what we know for sure is that before he died, actually, there is a legend that says that actually Nicolas Doria wanted to send John of the Cross to Mexico as a missionary. And at that point, he is a hermit living in La Peñuela, which was a hermitage. Almost he was living in exile, because they took all his administrative positions within the Carmelite, within the Discalced Carmelite order. So he's almost living in exile, and at the same time they are trying to figure out what to do. And what some people said is the intention of Doria was to send him to Mexico as a missionary just to get rid of him. So we don't want you in Spain, right? So go there. So we don't have to deal with you anymore. So it was a smart way maybe of trying to get rid of a very charismatic Carmelite, right? And you will not have any sort of challenges or opposition coming from him. But on the other hand, the other legend is that what if he wanted to also be part of the Christian tradition by expanding the message and using this opportunity to get a new and explore new worlds and new places and new people, and bring the message of love that he had in his heart and soul. So there are different readings about this, but what I will say in terms of the period in which he lived is that, remember, he was a friar. He lived very simple life, even though in a way he benefited from the conquest of the Americas and the expansion of the Spanish Empire around the globe, because of course they brought gold and brought wealth, right? Those who came back to the Iberian Peninsula brought money and wealth and knowledge with them about other cultures, and they took and they stole sometimes things from other cultures and other people. At the same time, John of the Cross, like Santa Teresa of Avila, they were very concerned about how we treat others. And in fact, they were very careful. Even Teresa's brothers were part of the conquest of the Americas. So they were very careful with what they were doing and saying. And for them, of course, the goal was not to conquer for the sake of conquering others, but rather it was an attempt to bring this evangelical message of love and compassion, so that even the native people deserve to be treated as children of God, even though they may have never heard about God or Christianity. So in that way, again, it goes back to the simple message that you should treat others as you would like to be treated, which is the golden rule. And once you know that God is present everywhere, that means God is also present in native communities who have never heard about God themselves. So that actually allows them to treat the other, to treat minority groups with respect, with human dignity, and with compassion, which they knew. Actually, they became, as we know, minorities in their own homeland. So they knew what is to suffer the consequences of a society that wants to protect their identity, and keep this purity of blood in place. And of course, we know that they mix with others. So I will not be surprised if they will have ever allowed San John of the Cross or even Teresa to cross the Atlantic Ocean. I will not be surprised if their communities will be a mix of indigenous people and Spanish, for sure. Because that's what you see today. Actually, if you visit Carmelite monasteries and convents, they are a mix. They in many places you find people from all continents living in those communities. But in those days, clearly we know that they allow Jewish converts and Moorish converts to enter into their Discalced Carmelite order, when, by the way, many other Catholic orders were prohibiting and banning people who were minority groups to enter their institutions. So that tells you how prophetic, in the sense of bearing witness to justice and love, they were, because they care about those who were left behind and those who were mistreated and abused. So I'm pretty sure if they would have seen what colonialism did in other parts of the world, they will stand in favor of their brothers and sisters who were victims of colonization, like Bartolomé de las Casas did when he stood against the all almighty Spanish Empire and the Catholic Church, and he denounced the abuse and the mistreatment of Native Americans in these continents.
All right. Well, thank you, Chris. I will turn to my friends, my colleagues, if there is one thing that you want to say as response, because time is running out now. But as we said before, that when we have good discussions, time really flies. Any one of you want to say something? Jonathan, Cynthia, Timo, or Fang Fang?
Yeah, thank you so much. That it's really clarified me to because I studied about mysticism in my bachelor degree, so I'm really thankful for everything that you've explained about Saint John, because in the heart of itself from the Saint John, that he want to make flourish the Thomist scholastic theology, and I have that heart too. I have it in my passion to for the Christian, especially in Indonesia, because we have the same problem in most evangelical reform church. Yeah, I don't know how to describe my grateful for this presentation of yours.
Actually, Thomas Merton wrote a book about St. John of the Cross scholastic theology. It's called The Ascent to Truth. That's the most scholastic work that Thomas Merton did, following the footsteps of St. John of the Cross. Although later, of course, he said, that was not my cup of tea. That was not the language that I feel more at home with. And I believe that Thomas Merton and St. John of the Cross in that way share so many similarities, because they were more mystical theologians than scholastic theologians.
Wow, amazing. Wow, so insightful. Whew.
Thank you.
Maybe others? Okay, if not, I want to say thank you to Chris, because now I'm learning about public theology, and because of your lecture, I know there's an option for mystical theology like that. Wow, it's fascinating. Thank you.
Yeah.
Awesome. Maybe others?
And if you
Timothy?
and you can be in contact also with the Carmelites in Avila. I highly recommend the chance, look at their program, be in contact with them, because they have a lot of things. They offer a lot of webinars and conferences, and they are very public.
That's why it's awesome.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
One more comment from Cynthia or Timo or Fang Fang. Okay, so let me turn to Chris now. Chris, if St. John still lives today, what does he still have to say for the current situation of injustice, of racism, of segregation, of pandemic, probably? What do you think? This is your closing statement, probably, Chris.
I mean, this will be a lifetime kind of moment to go more in depth with each one of these topics. But for sure, I know for sure that St. John of the Cross, like Thomas Merton, they saw that their roles was not just to be a monk inside the monastery, but to be a monk for everyone. For everyone, as a child of God, they understood their responsibilities towards everyone. And that means we're all children of God, we're all interconnected, and we must speak out and speak truth to power, right? And I mean, the Bible is very clear that we have to speak truth to power and principalities. And John of the Cross will have for sure stood in the midst of all the social, economic, ecological crisis and racist issues that we're facing today in North America and around the globe. They will promote and advocate for the victims of this mistreatment and abuse that is systemic. It's systemic and is in many institutions, including the Catholic Church, and in American democracies, in American institutions, is very ingrained. So they will be working towards peace and justice, but they will do it without hatred. They will do it without anger. They will do it without animosity or hostility, but they will do it out of love, even towards their enemies. They will do it with with an empathetic understanding from where the problem comes from and why we cannot get along together, right? And where we cannot live in peace, and why we have to discriminate people just based on the color of the skin, when we know that we all blood the same way and we all come from the human family. And if we all believe that we are all children of God, why we have to put people down and mistreat and abuse others? So clearly, Thomas Merton, I mean, he died in 1968. I have also my own suspicions of his death. I have talked about it in the International Thomas Merton Society. He stood as a good prophet, modern prophet, dealing with all these topics from nuclear warfare to the war in Vietnam, to nuclear disarmament, to Native Americans. He wrote a beautiful essay on Ishi as the last human being of this tribe in California, of First Nation, which disappeared as a result of the genocide. So I'm pretty sure John of the Cross and John of the Cross will be like Merton, speaking out on these important issues and educating people and raising awareness and taking action and becoming members of fellowships and movements like Merton did with the Fellowship of Reconciliation, and working with the Berrigan brothers and many other controversial figures. But Sidney Griffith, B.D. Griffith and many others were part of this movement to bring contemplation in action, right? To bring a prophetic message through their contemplative eyes, and address the most serious moral, ethical, social, economic, and religious issues of our time. No better time to have more contemplatives in action than now, when the world is facing not only coronavirus, but we're facing probably the worst climate change effects in humanity as we know it. I mean, many places right now, as we speak, are going to hit 50 degrees centigrade, more than 110 degrees Fahrenheit, and there will be more droughts and more scarcity of water, and that means that if we don't pay attention to the spiritual canticle in St. John of the Cross, right? If we don't pay attention to the stories of Genesis, if we don't pay more attention to the Thomas Merton, Dorothy Days, Santa Teresa's of Calcutta's, and many others, examples of contemplatives who live dedicated fully to serve God and humanity and creation, clearly we are going to continue this path of distraction. So what we can do is, again, we have a choice. We can choose to plant the seeds of love and compassion, or we can follow the path of distraction and the seeds and cultivate the seeds of hatred and fear that paralyze us and make us complice and guilty bystanders, as Merton will call it, in this crisis, social and economic and ecological crisis that we are facing, and they are devastating our communities. It's sad to see all the things that are going around in our lives. I just actually experienced a bad episode even in my own neighborhood, and it was really sad to see the 18 years old shot, and just in a simple party. I mean, a life, it seems like for some people don't have any value, and we are living in a very difficult, life nowadays, where people are losing values, they are disconnected, they feel, that other people don't care, that they don't listen to them, and I think John of the Cross and Merton and many others will be definitely in the front of the movement to give hope where there is no hope, bring, a sense of justice where there is no justice, and bring especially a sense of love and compassion to those who are more in need.
Well, Dr. Serran-Pagan, thank you very much for your presentation. This is very insightful, inspiring, and mind-blowing new stuff I learned from your presentation, and thank you so much. And please remember that if you go back to Indonesia, you have friends in Indonesia, you can contact any of these people and you will have good connections to visit Yogyakarta or Jakarta or Malang or even Bali if you go
Yes.
back to Bali. So thank you again, Chris, for your time. Thank you for your generosity. Thank you for this presentation, and good luck with your next projects. Thank you so
you.
much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you,
Thank you for
friends.
inviting. Thank you.